You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your Führer host, Abraham.
Oh, no. And I guess I'll be your globally free host, Shane.
Nice. I'm not going to be a Führer host. I just for the sake of the topic today. It's not an aspiration of mine in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's good to know. As being somebody on the show with you, it's nice to know that that's not something you're aspiring to.
Yeah, or even be associated with, really.
Yeah.
So we have a heavier topic today, I think. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Interesting place for you to come in, probably. Maybe not having heard the show before, you might be thinking we get to just talk about things like depression and stuff like that. And we do here and there.
Mm-hmm, sure.
But sometimes we talk about like the really big things that we do on a very large scale. And one of them is how we organize a system of society around a power structure, if you will.
Yeah, and I think this is something that maybe a lot of folks have pondered over the last several years.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out kind of what the hell's going on and why we are experiencing the things that we are. And so hopefully today, I mean, we're going to cover a little bit of that and maybe give you some answers to why we do that.
Yeah, why do we do that thing? And if you're listening to this on the day that it publishes, then congratulations, it is January 25th. And there are some holidays that are recognized nationally and internationally that land on January 25th. And one of them is Observe the Weather Day. So there's that.
Yeah. Go look outside. There's also National Florida Day, which I don't think that we deserve a birthday, but here we are.
Or some kind of day. It's a thing.
Or some kind of day.
It's National IV Nurse Day, so celebrate those people who are out there helping to put IVs in you.
Yeah, especially the ones who can do it the first time and not the 15th time.
That's right.
That's not their fault. That's usually sometimes the vein's fault.
Yeah.
All right, it's also National Fish Taco Day, so if you enjoy something like that, I probably would not recommend fish tacos in, let's say, I don't know, Idaho, or somewhere that's not really near a large body of water that can produce fresh fish, but, you know, that's just a personal preference.
Them's fighting words for the Idahoans.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to make a lot of enemies at some point in time, so we might as well just pick off every state as we go.
Fair.
We're coming for you, Montana.
It is National Irish Coffee Day.
Oh, that sounds sweet, I guess. I don't know. It sounds like surly, maybe. I don't know. I've never had an Irish coffee that I liked.
Okay.
So I'll just say it like that.
Yeah.
It's also Room of One's Own Day.
And if all of those things didn't make sense to you, well, congratulations, because it is also, hilariously, National Opposite Day.
Yes, so basically, you can celebrate Florida if you want to, but you don't have to, and you can do the opposite and tear it down.
Yeah, you could not observe the weather. You could not, well, I'm not going to say don't be nice to IV nurses, just be nice to them regardless.
Yeah.
You could have whatever the opposite of a fish taco is, I guess a mushroom taco?
A steak burger?
There you go. Yeah, a steak burger taco. You could have a non-alcoholic coffee and share a room with a lot of people.
Yeah.
And then all of those things are the opposite. There's also a week of celebration. It is Snow Sculpting Week, which I think a lot of people in the United States at the time that this is published will be able to do.
Yeah. Abraham, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
What is snow?
Great. This is because it's Florida Day.
Yeah. And we don't have that here. That's a mythical thing in our area.
Yeah. Imagine the rain came down as fluffy ice cubes when it rains there, and that it
sounds like it hurts.
It did not. And it does not run off into the gutters or lakes or streams, but instead just piles up everywhere.
That sounds messy.
Yeah, they'd be like going out into a world of vanilla bean frappuccino all around you.
Oh, good. And then people screaming about there not being whipped cream on it. That sounds horrible. Actually, that sounds lovely. I like that.
Yeah, just don't eat the snow. You know what's been in there. There's a couple of things to celebrate for the month, which is it is Be Kind to Servers Month, which should be every month, but we'll definitely make an effort this month to be kind to our servers.
Yes, absolutely. And it's also hot tea month, which makes sense for January. So hopefully you get your favorite green tea or black tea or even maybe a white tea or a red tea or an oolong tea, whatever type of tea you like.
Or an Irish tea. And be kind to your barista.
Mm-hmm, always.
Okay.
Because they will make your drink decaf, by the way.
So all of that is maybe kind of tangentially related to our topic today, which is we're talking about governments and one specific type of government, although we'll see that there's actually multiple types of this, and that is authoritarian governments.
Yeah. So again, we were kind of discussing that this is something that has come up in the last few years. And so it is, even though it's something that has existed for quite some time in human history, it is something that's been kind of a major talking point in the United States, at least for some time, at least since, 2020, 2016, whatever year that was. So we thought it would be good to kind of maybe start defining and describing what's going on here, talk about some maybe variations of it, and kind of how people lead into being able to accept an authoritarian government.
Yeah, why do some people prefer that type of thing? Why does the world seem to be trending that direction based on available data?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you hear the term authoritarianism and some derivation, whatever it might be, with respect to politics. We've also probably heard the term authoritative parenting, meaning strict parenting, or even leadership in a non-political setting. You might describe a supervisor who expects all of their directions to be followed to a T, full stop, no arguing, that sort of thing. And that's sort of the way that you might have heard authoritarian or authoritarianism around you.
And this is often associated with some type of negative connotation. So, it's usually related to obedience, enforcement, dictatorship, domineering, control freaks, fascist, abusive, bullying, discipline, tyrant. We can't break all those down, but we're going to maybe do a little bit of what we call a little equivalency or maybe kind of word association test here. If I say tyrant, what word comes to mind?
Stalin. Hitler.
Stalin. Okay, I went with Trump, but that worked. Whatever, but those work too. If I say authority, what word comes to mind?
For me, I just watched the His Dark Materials series, so the God figure in that, but which does make a certain amount of sense.
Specific.
Yeah, it is. But I would also think probably like a police force of some reason, for me at least.
Yeah. Now, when we use these terms, we think about maybe, as the listener, you can go into what type of people come into mind, what settings, what jobs and careers. You might have like specific supervisors or specific bosses that you've experienced. You might have some experience somewhere where you can go, oh yeah, this person that I know, this person that I had experience with, this person that I worked with has an authoritative or authoritarian, I should say, type of approach to the world or maybe a worldview, or they engage in what we would describe or what you might describe as authoritarian behaviors.
So it'll be important to define this moving forward so that we can ensure that we're all on the same sort of page with respect to the topic at hand. And so authoritarianism or authoritarian is favoring or enforcing strict obedience to authority, especially that of the government or a government, and often or almost always at the expense of personal freedom.
Yes. Maybe this is like a good time to insert a recommendation to go read Beyond Freedom and Dignity by Skinner. I think that's probably a good way to kind of counteract some of this stuff. I don't know.
Sure.
That's just a thought that I had.
Okay.
Now, we might think of this as extremely rigid rule governed behavior, or basically rule following behavior, likely with a definitive kind of shift towards punitive consequences rather than rewarding consequences. So a lot of times what will happen is somebody will be in power maybe, or a government will be in power, and there are very strict rules, and those rules have to be followed, or there's a lot of punishment involved. Like there's a lot of like really kind of aversive consequences that are going to come up as a result of not following those rules.
Yeah, and we'll shout out Patrick for helping put together these notes for us. And he gives the example here of an elementary school where you might have a child who's told to do something and the child says no. And what is the likely outcome of that child then saying no? If you said, oh, there's probably some problem solving, identify why the child said no, and maybe see what kind of barriers were in place or motivations and that sort of thing, then you might want to head back to school for a minute. But it's more likely, in fact, that we'll see some form of reprimand, removal, or withholding of some kind of fun stuff like missing time from recess or getting detention, that sort of thing, or bringing in the parents through a phone call or sending some kind of note home. And so you see this sort of the way of managing or dealing with their disobedience, if you will, is to use some kind of punishment to reprimand and try and minimize that behavior.
The kind of goal here in these situations is that the person that is in that position of power or that authoritarian kind of like that space, the idea is to impose a type of control over another. And there must be relevant contextual variables or things in place that do allow for that person to kind of take control. So there needs to exist a kind of power dynamic, supervisor, supervisee, kind of like, teacher student type of dynamic. And it usually involves multiple parties, where one party specifically not only is implicitly or explicitly given some power, so that group or that person is given some power, but the oppressed individuals in this circumstance, or the sometimes you'll hear this group described as the grievance population, they are part of a socio-cultural dynamic where unfair use of this dynamic is expected, normed, and even potentially encouraged. So think about this for a second. There are two groups of people. One group is specifically given power, and they use that power to oppress another group and kind of maintain control over that other group.
And that group is expected to just accept that as that's the norm. That's how things go.
Yes.
And even potentially believe we deserve this and it should be this way.
Right.
Is a thing that can happen. Otherwise, that type of control just looks like empty threats. The verbal statements fall within analysis of, the say-do correspondence of whether or not you're following through. And in an authoritarian government, you really are going to see follow through on a lot of those threats a lot of the time. Although there are often plenty of empty threats as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes the thing is like the empty threats are made less empty by one or two examples sometimes, and then those examples make them less empty in some circumstances. But we'll talk more about some of that stuff later. Now, regardless of the environment where it does occur, there are several common components that you can find in kind of an authoritarian context. One is exclusion or ignoring of values or beliefs of the oppressed. So you've got your grievance population that has a specific set of values, a specific kind of their own set of rules, their own set of guidelines, and the group or the party in power tends to completely ignore it, exclude it, or actively destroy it. And you see that happen a lot. I mean, that's kind of like the biggest criticism with the British Empire and imperialism is a lot of times they wouldn't go to be like, hey, we'd like to know more about what you guys do. They go, hey, we'd like to take everything that you do, turn it into our thing, and then oppress you for a very long time.
Yeah, very much so.
Take that, Britain. Sorry, we're coming after everybody today. Also, the United States does it, so I can't say that we didn't do that too. So I'm not trying to do that.
Yeah, I think a lot of governments, I think, would easily be accused of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Almost the reason they've ever been able to develop the kind of power that they have in many instances. So, as a consideration. Another thing here is that authoritarians will often have very specific visions, tasks, goals, behaviors that are considered acceptable to whatever those visions are, that sort of vision is of how things should be, and will tolerate very little or no deviation from that. It's just considered unacceptable. And there is literally nothing or close to nothing over which the authoritarian does not have control or the potential to control in one's life. And that even includes, they'll try and control people's thinking. Mm-hmm. And, we were just talking about 1984 recently as an example, again, not of like how governments even ever have behaved, but of the desire to want to control people's thoughts.
Yeah, and you can actually see this in a lot of kind of almost like a cult leader manual on how to be the best kind of cult leader. And we'll link in a story about the Anthill Kids, which is a harrowing tale. If you don't know about that cult and kind of that situation, it was real bad.
Yikes.
But a lot of cult leaders will kind of leverage a lot of coercion and punishment in those spaces where there are very specific rules. And if you do not follow those rules, you either get punished severely or you get kicked out of the cult.
Yeah, that's a great point, and a really good example of trying to control the sort of thoughts, feelings, and values of the people over which you have power. And that goes to the trying to even control their thoughts, as I said, or their opinions about things. Mm-hmm. And you can do that to some extent through basic manipulation, fear, rhetoric, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and deprivation of basic needs, there's all kinds of stuff that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. You're exactly right. Other examples of this type of thing include military, and actually we'll get to talking about the military a little bit more later on, but you also see this in gangs, even in construction sites, manufacturing sites, courtrooms, where you have this very strict rule from an authority figure who, again, tolerates very little deviation from that rule. And so it's probably worth spending a little bit of time just talking about how they go about enforcing these policies. But first, you are going to be forced to listen to some ads. We've been talking about what authoritarians sort of do, and so let's get to how they do that, which is through their use of enforcement and what that looks like.
Yeah, so many times what the kind of like the power move is the reliance on some kind of aversive control or some kind of punishment or coercion. And basically just these threats that indicate that if you do not follow these rules, there are going to be bad things that happen. And there could be varying degrees of that. In many really extreme cases, there are not varying degrees. There are, oh, you said something that I don't really like. Now you're going to jail for 6 years. I mean, if you want to watch, if anybody has seen Andor, that's an example of like where Andor was like kind of walking around, hanging out, goes to court, and then gets sentenced to 6 years for kind of just like being there. So like there's like this like kind of aversive control situation where it's just like pain and punishment and scariness that keeps behavior under control to some degree.
Right. Or in the TV show, also popular, The Handmaid's Tale, that shows in Gilead, the sort of primary location for most of that show, there is so little disobedience tolerated that people will just disappear. They'll be strung up on a wall once they've been killed. They'll be publicly brutalized in one way or another, or shamed, or what have you. And this is for things as little as, not to spoil anything too much, but one character who's a female asks for permission to read and has her finger chopped off for asking if she can read.
Right.
Like as an example of authoritarian government, like that's what that would look like.
Another kind of hallmark of authoritarian situations are just there's basically little to no tolerance of disagreement with the authoritarian, regardless of how strong the oppression is. And what we mean by that is that whether it's somebody who's in power and they have kind of like a large control over a large population and it's really severe, or if it's maybe a small group, there's really no kind of like, this is okay. This little bit of dissent is okay. It's very much so my way or the highway, and any sort of disagreement or dissent can lead to some kind of punishing consequence in varying degrees of severity. So we kind of see here where, you could speak out, like, we always kind of talk about freedom of speech in the United States, where I can talk trash about my president and not have to worry about going to jail or being executed. But there are other places where, like, even like any sort of insinuation that the emperor or the president or the elected official is doing something wrong could lead to death or incarceration.
Yeah, exactly. From the government specifically. Like,
yes.
Yeah. And just an important consideration, because a lot of people will try and say that their freedom is being threatened when they are participating in spaces that are not controlled by the government, that are controlled by private entities that choose how they regulate speech and behavior in those spaces.
Yes.
And then people are arguing like my freedom is being impinged. Like, your freedom wasn't guaranteed in the space. You went somewhere that is not protected space,
right,
and use that in whatever way. And this is true. So you look at like all these alt-right social media platforms that have popped up, they have got far stricter rules on the kinds of speech that's tolerated in their quote unquote free spaces than you'll find in other social media places. And that's perfectly okay. Like, you can come here and say whatever you want, as long as you don't criticize the establishment or say anything bad at all about the people who are sort of in charge of this thing.
Yep, exactly.
Which is what Twitter has become. So
yeah, I also never had to give my social security number to get on Facebook, but when you get on the Parler, you got to be able to give that to get in. So,
well, let's hope nobody hacks that.
Yeah. I mean, that's fine. They can do that.
Yeah, exactly.
We're not encouraging it. We're just not going to be mad if it happens.
Exactly. So considering the fact that like you can't even disagree with an authoritarian figure, and then you're just granted no sense of autonomy at all. There's no growth. There's no autonomy that is afforded to or earned by workers that are beneath that leader. You are where you are, and you're going to be there because that's what your place is. Know your place, is basically what's sort of said in that statement. And subordinates, all they do is follow directions. That's it. That's all they're expected to do. That's all they're allowed to do. The only way to succeed and continue to survive is deference and obedience to the one leader, the person who's in charge.
Yep, absolutely. So I think in order to continue to maybe illustrate the severity of this and maybe how far reaching this can go, we want to share a story. And this is a story about a family or a group of people called the Great White Brotherhood, which already sounds bad, but they're also known as the family. And so this starts in the 1960s. So let's go back to a time where there seemed to be a lot of cults for some reason. I think everybody was listening to like weird psychedelic, like the Age of Aquarius and all that. And so people were like, we can start a cult. But this started with Anne Hamilton Byrne, and she was a yoga teacher in the 1960s in Australia. She had a great following of quote unquote clients who began to talk about their unhappy marriages, finding meaning in life, etc., etc., etc. And what she ended up doing was she recruited Raynor Johnson, who was a physicist who was becoming more interested in unconventional areas. Okay, so again, remember in the 1960s, spiritualism, mysticism, opening your third eye, all of that stuff started really taking hold in the 60s. Everybody was looking for enlightenment in the New Age, and that's where kind of like New Age readings comes from, is this time period where everybody was like super into a lot of this stuff. So you kind of see this kind of gain traction in the entire world, not just Australia.
And interestingly, Johnson hosted these regular meetings on religion and philosophy by Hamilton Byrne on his property outside Melbourne, I think it's pronounced by the Australians, where he also recruited wealthy New Age professionals to sort of help fund and spread the cause.
Yeah.
The meetings included sermons and these discourses. I think it's sort of like a culty TED Talk, like internal TED Talk, if you will.
Yeah. I believe Melbourne is also called Crikey City, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, cool.
I don't know. It's just I don't know anything about that side of the world. All right. So during the late 60s and early 70s, they began to acquiring infants and children.
Yikes.
Specifically, Anne started acquiring infants and children, which should immediately spark some kind of concerns.
Very little good comes out of a sentence that starts with, they began acquiring infants and children.
To be very clear, we did not say adopted. We said acquired. Now, some of these were natural family members, children of members and stuff like that. Others were adopted from New Haven Hospital, which was a psychiatric hospital that heavily used LSD as an approach. So here's a direct quote. You had babies born in cult hospitals, delivered by cult midwives, handed over to cult social workers. And that was from Lex DeMann, which is just sounds wild.
And of course, they immediately changed the surnames to Hamilton Byrne to correspond with their leader. And these children growing up in this culty atmosphere were required to wear similar clothes, dye the hair uniformly blonde, and even wear similar haircuts and all that. So there was a high degree of control over even basic appearance.
And now this group had several stated goals. One, they wanted to make efforts to dehumanize the members of the group, to make efforts to enforce compliance, and to instill belief that all children were related. So this is kind of, when we talked about those earlier, we talked about those immovable rules where you kind of like, these are the things that you have to do. This is what we're talking about. It's like, these are specific rules that you have to follow as part of this group.
Yeah, so much so that here's a quote. It goes, quote, "There was only one rule. Do absolutely everything she said. That included what to think, what to wear, what to eat, who to marry, and who not to marry. Total obedience," end quote. And this is from David Whitaker.
Yeah, so children were homeschooled with little to no interest in actual raising of the children, but specifically on compliance. And compliance was often left to what they described as aunties, which were middle-aged followers who specifically enforced punishment on children in an effort to avoid contacting punishment themselves. So this included denial of food and like basic needs. So you've got the one rule is you follow what I say, and then everybody else kind of does whatever that person says to avoid any sort of punishment, including the removal of food and basic needs and all the stuff that somebody would need to survive.
Once they reached the age of 14, then they got to experience something they called an initiation. And during this, the children were given just huge, well, the quote here is huge, relentless doses of LSD to, again, help indoctrinate them into this culture mindset. And Hamilton Byrne believed that she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, massive doses of LSD.
Yeah.
And that her family would rule the world once all the non-believers were destroyed. So not super dissimilar from other sort of extreme religious cults out there.
Yeah. Also, probably just needed to talk to somebody a little bit about this. This is actually, again, kind of thanking Patrick for putting together these notes. He grabbed a really interesting picture that shows some of the kids from this group, and they all have the same haircut. Their hair is white blonde, and they're all wearing like variations of like a white collar shirt with like a long sleeve smock or like an overcoat that's like a dark blue or purple color.
Yeah.
It is an unsettling photo.
Yeah.
It looks like Children of the Corn type of situation. It's really uncomfortable, and it's sad that it's real.
I was about to say, it looks like straight out of a horror movie. So Google this image. If you're a Patreon, then you'll be able to see this in our published notes for this episode. You get access to things like that when you join us on Patreon. But otherwise, if you Google it, you'll probably find it that way as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's get into this. Where does authoritarianism come from? And what are the causes and that sort of thing? There's the primary approaches of, is this innate or learned? Of course, that's sort of how people always talk about it, nature and nurture. So is it innate or learned? With respect to those kind of considerations, a question that commonly comes up, and if it's innate, then supposedly that means it's genetic. It's somehow hardwired into our genes to prefer a particular system of government. I don't know how our genes would do that, but that is a hypothesis. And we'd expect some similarity in genetic endowment of populations across different countries. However, there's a wide variation in political governments across countries over time that really kind of precludes a deterministic biological account. This comes from Penner 2008, who's arguing against that idea. So there's not a lot of evidence to support that we're biologically hardwired to support a authoritarian style system of governance. Also, there's not a logical reason for that.
Right. And then on the other side of that, for social learning, when you make the argument that social learning is to account, there's not enough specifically of a causal relationship. There's not really enough there to be able to make that argument, because in certain environments, authoritarian experiences are more common than others. So like we kind of had this like really weird situation where it's like, where does it really come from? The fact is, and specifically the fact that authoritarianism has ever existed demonstrates that we are biologically prepared with the capacity for it, I guess. But the fact is that it is not ubiquitous and generally regarded as an undesirable in our context, which is evidence that it is likely learned and social more than it would be genetic. However, we're going to share some other resources to kind of talk about what that looks like too.
So before we get into that, you'll just have to ponder it while these ads play. Let's talk about we'll continue to dig in on this idea of there being sort of innate or learned capacity for authoritarianism and that sort of thing. And what we sort of already described was that it's probably not entirely biological. We also don't have any evidence to tell us why it develops from a social learning perspective, but that it probably is socially learned due to the variability and also the fact that it is not consistent or ubiquitous. So there's probably a combination of those factors. You have some biologicalness, as we said, there's the capacity for it. And combined with the fact that there is the variable of the relative power and economic inequality that comes with that government.
Right. So I think that's really important to note. So when we talk about economic resources, when they're distributed unequally, you find that people with more resources tend to be in more power, and they tend to kind of hold sway over the folks that are not in power. And this is a really important thing. This kind of comes back a lot when you look at some of the research, is that when there's economic instability or economic uncertainty, it's very easy for people to kind of appeal to an authoritarian figure, or like somebody who is in power. So this is really important when we recognize things like privilege and specifically socioeconomic status and how that plays a role in accepting authoritarian views.
Yeah, it's interesting, as you said, we'll talk a little bit more about the fact that it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle, because the authoritarian inspires fear, it creates instability and inequality. Inequality tends to seek out safety that is afforded by the people who are creating the danger in the first place, interestingly.
Yeah.
But again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just to say that when inequality is greater, meaning that there's more inequality, the people who are on the more marginalized end of that, who are the more oppressed, they tend to be in those positions of subservience. This is the employer-employee dynamic. We're talking, and this is in a capitalistic sort of society. Power comes from the employer. they can control the various resources like money based on the performance of those who are lower in the hierarchy, but they're the ones who are in control of that distribution.
The same is true for people who have those extra resources when it comes to things like sales, right? So a richer individual or a richer organization has more and faster access to goods and specifically services, which allows them access through, other means like legal and social means, but it ends up giving them kind of a leg up. So like an example is, unfortunately, I don't like the Dallas Cowboys, but the Dallas Cowboys versus the Detroit Lions. The Dallas Cowboys are valued at $8 billion, where the Detroit Lions are valued at $3.05 billion, which probably explains why the Lions are always playing on Thanksgiving Day when other teams don't have to. That doesn't really, I think that's just tradition. But the Cowboys can actually build newer stadiums. They have more vendors. They have more seats in their stadiums. They can buy more expensive players. They're less impacted by maybe bad player purchases because they can pay for talent. I mean, the same is true for like the LA Lakers or the New York Yankees. When you look at other sports, like when you have these teams that have a ton of money, I always kind of joke, I'm like, the Yankees, if you go to the Yankees, you're a sellout because they are like the corporate team because they can afford to buy all the talent. So is it really fair? That's always a thing that comes up. But yeah, when you have a team like and that's sports specifically, that doesn't really account for everything, but that's kind of a discussion on resource inequality.
Yeah, no, as a quick reminder, you might hear something like 3 billion versus 8 billion and think, well, that's only $5 billion. And just as a reminder, the difference between 3 billion and 8 billion is more money than you and everyone you know put together will ever see in like 5 generations of your lifetime.
Yes.
So
yes,
that's an enormous difference in power.
But much less money than Elon Musk has lost over the last couple months. So,
Fair point. But so with all of this, we're talking about this inequality, but there's an important element in here that again comes to the learning piece of this, which is that perceived inequality can be just as powerful as real inequality, which is people made to believe that they don't have access to resources can have as damaging an effect on their autonomy as people not actually having access to those resources. And so there is an important sort of mind game control aspect of this to consider.
Yeah, and this goes back to the idea of like false rules and real rules, and then things that people kind of respond to. So, in the United States right now, people are kind of having a hard time because you're starting to see the price of things that are normally not so expensive start to creep up, like eggs or gas. Like those things happen and people get real nervous. And so they start voting for people or kind of subsiding with people that will say, I'll bring those down. And they make kind of like false promises they can't even really keep. So people are being denied resources. They're not able to access sources because they don't have the resources to purchase those things. And it turns into kind of like this, like you said, like this kind of vicious cycle where people are kind of perpetually stuck in a situation where they're always having to rely on someone in power making promises that will help them, and they never really follow through.
Yeah, and the deprivation of resources, failed attempts to resist those authoritarian, all those things that people will experience in that situation that impacts their future attempts to try and get out of that situation.
Yeah.
And so there's this concept in psychology called learned helplessness, which many of our audience will already know. But just in case you don't, or you're not familiar with that term, it kind of is what it sounds like. It means you effectively learn to not advocate for yourself. You adopt the mindset that you are incapable of something because of the number of times that you have failed to be able to do it. And oftentimes not through any fault of your own. It often comes from just a history of constant punishment from somebody else of like, I can't win in this situation. So you just kind of sit there and take the abuse. And that learned helplessness can be seen in a lot of areas if you know what it is and then how to look for it.
Yeah.
I mean, you start to see those people who just accept it. They're just like, well, this is just, my lot in life, and there's no getting out of a bad situation.
It's very much so the idea, like somebody just going, what's the point?
Yeah.
Why bother?
Yeah, basically.
I mean, that's really what it is. So we're going to pivot a little bit because there's this really cool resource called Freedom House. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what freedom and authoritarianism looks like across the globe. And so Freedom House was actually formed in the 1940s as a way to advocate and encourage freedom across the world, including how to access freedoms in one area and how it can impact access to freedoms in another. And so they kind of look at these different variables, and we're going to kind of talk about those different things. Mostly what they look at are civil liberties and political rights, and how those two things, and now with the inclusion of the internet, how those things influence freedom and freedom from authoritarian governments, how those are impacted across the globe.
Yeah, and so thinking of like individual liberty, that sort of thing. They also put together a timeline of like how the countries that have improved their freedom versus countries that have declined and the available freedom. And we'll talk about that after this. But I think just to run through these is kind of interesting. The first one they give is Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
And the global freedom score that they get out of 100 is 7, which is not free.
Nope.
This is women and religious minorities face discrimination in law. Officials at the national level are not elected. Dissent from the government is criminalized. And so to separate that out, their global freedom score of 7 is their political rights and their civil liberties, which they got a 1 on political rights and a 6 on their civil liberties. And that's 1 out of 40 and 6 out of 60. 40 and 60 make 100. So you can sort of see how that aligns.
That's how math works.
Yeah, that is how math works. And so for the political rights, kings rule for life. They're not elected. It's unrealistic that opposition parties will ever be able to gain power if they even exist at all.
Yeah. And then from the civil liberty standpoint, where they got a 6 out of 60, government controls domestic media content, so they don't get as much information to them.
Right.
And laws are vaguely worded, giving considerable discretion to authorities. So you kind of have like you saw in Qatar with morality police, right? Like in different places that you're seeing these types of things where it makes it so that the larger populations can be oppressed more effectively through those authorities.
Interestingly, they got a freedom score of 24 out of 100 for Saudi Arabia, which again is very low, but I don't think that's factored into the global freedom score.
Right. So in contrast, let's take a look at Madagascar. Okay, so Madagascar has a global freedom score of 61 out of 100. So they're described as partly free, and they only recently returned to electoral politics in 2013. What they found was that this was partly due to the persistence of corruption and denial of protest that were happening for so much and so long. Those folks that were in those movements continue to persist. They continue to go forward, and they continue to press the government to do better.
Again, that was 61 out of 100 for the global versus 7 out of 100 for Saudi Arabia's global freedom.
Yep.
And so Madagascar's political rights score was 27 out of 40, so not great. And they reduced their Senate size to potentially limit the influence of opponents. And there are 200 plus political parties registered in Madagascar, but their financial barriers exist to being able to get much impact in what they're able to do.
Yeah. Now, their civil liberty score is 34 out of 60. They have a constitution that grants religious liberty, though it is really inconsistently applied. And same for freedom of assembly. So they have these rights that are kind of, I don't know if they're quite codified, but they do exist and there are written documents.
Right.
But they are, because they're not really kind of supported or they are not applied to certain circumstances as consistently, they scored lower on their liberties.
Yeah, but still doing better than Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and they have no data. There's no data on internet freedom. So that was something that we wanted to point out.
Right. Speaking of doing better than Saudi Arabia, the United States has a global freedom score of 83 out of 100, and this is classified as free.
So free?
So free, almost the freest.
We got a B plus and free.
That's right. That is kind of just a B.
That's maybe a B minus. Yeah, it might be a B minus. Yeah, it's a B minus and free.
In the United States, we historically have a strong rule of law, and there are freedoms of expression and of religion that are guaranteed by the government. This has been eroded recently due to partisan pressure on elections and bias in our criminal justice system. We have the most extensively applied criminal justice system and incarcerated population of any industrialized country in the world by leaps and bounds. Like nobody incarcerates people at the rate that we do in the United States.
We're number one. We're number one.
And this is why we don't have any crime in the United States. It's all gone.
Yeah, it's all gone because punishment works, apparently. I would like to also point out while we're on it, this is going to make so many people mad. Canada, much freer than us. I believe that Canada's got a score of, let me go back to global freedom. It was 98 out of 100. So free.
Whoa.
Our northern neighbors. So anyway, now the United States have political rights. Their score was 32 out of 40. Elections are considered fair, though recent partisanship has emerged and kind of is trying to maybe, you might see that score drop because of the way that people are kind of removing rights and making it difficult for people to vote. The Electoral College exists, but might limit individual influence, which we have seen on some occasions, and then power changes hands regularly, which is actually a good thing,
right?
Overall, that's a good thing no matter which side you're on, because you want that to be kind of an ongoing rotating door.
Yeah, the Electoral College specifically exists to make sure that it is not balanced and fair.
Right.
And so that's I think something dragging that score down a little bit.
Right.
And then of course the partisanship. On civil liberties, the United States, not stakes.
Or skates.
Or skates. The U.S. gets a 51 out of 60. Pretty good. We generally have free media. That even includes, like, you can kind of just go on and say whatever. Generally, news channels will do better when they report to a wider audience, but there are plenty that are pretty successful reporting nonsense, bias, completely fabricated stuff.
Yes.
There's also been some recent government hostility toward the free press, which is, again, a move toward authoritarianism, is when you start to oppress journalism and the freedom of the press.
Right. When you make enemies of the media, the free media, then that becomes that's a hallmark of authoritarian regimes.
Yeah. One of the first things that they do, actually, will be to shut down the free press.
Yeah. Shut down the free press, control information, then go from there. All right. So the last country we're going to just highlight for comparison is Sweden. Sweden has a global freedom score of 100 out of 100. They are so free. And there are a couple of, like, Norwegian countries and stuff around there too that have similar scores.
They're so free they can fly. They're not even bound by the rules of gravity.
Yeah, that's what I am saying. They are the Leonard Skinner free bird of the world. Now, their rights are legally guaranteed and they're respected, which is nice. And so, and within that, you have, when we talk about their political rights, they scored a 40 out of 40. They have free and fair elections. There has been some secrecy that's been a kind of a concern. Maybe there's some issues with transparency, but it has only kind of recently started to bubble up. And there are 8 different political parties that secured representation in 2018. So as opposed to the United States, which is typically 2, maybe 3.
Yeah. Whew. 8 parties.
8 parties.
That would be impressive.
I would love that.
I know. I would appreciate representation where I feel like there are groups of people who would like to see a representative that they feel better suits their interests than the one that's like, I guess they're close enough,
right?
How they tend to be. So
it's that episode of The Simpsons.
Which one's that?
It's the one where the aliens are like, hey, you have to vote for one of us. It's a 2-party system. And it's like they're voting for which alien is going to control the world.
Yes, that is good. I think that was a Treehouse of Horror episode.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, because they all were made slaves in Springfield.
There's also on their civil liberties score, of course, they received a 60 out of 60 because that all adds up to 100%. They have freedom of religion encouraged, though religious hate crimes are often not reported, so something to consider there. And trade unions represent 70% of the workforce and are well organized.
Wow.
So super freedom. Yeah, look at that. You can go there and work and be protected and have all the civil liberties you want and have free and fair elections and feel good about your contribution to the government's contribution to you, and what that means in that place. Or you can, live in Saudi Arabia if you want.
Yeah, I mean, choices. So while you ponder where you're going to move and uproot your family and maybe where you're going to get meaningful, gainful employment, sounds like maybe Sweden is the place to go. We're going to give you some ads to kind of contemplate this and ponder away.
All right, we took away your freedom by making you listen to ads. We're trying to bring it back by getting back on topic with our conversation. Let's talk about the fact that what we've been alluding to is the expansion of authoritarianism around the globe in recent years. And there's some dialogue here about whether the internet and media in general depicts it this way. Is there an actual increase in authoritarianism, or do we just have a better access to what's happening in the world? It seems like there actually is. We have some data on that.
And what we've seen so far are that 60 countries have seen a decline in democracy in the last 16 years, while only 25 have improved. That's kind of a bad sign.
Yeah, that's not great.
When more countries are declining in democracy and others are and only several have improved, we want to see that number turned around a little bit. We want to see 0 declining in democracy is what we really want to see.
Yeah, and actually 2021 was the worst year on record since 2005 when the data goes back for the number of countries that improved. 2020 was the worst year. That showed the biggest decline in democracy of the last 60 years.
Yeah.
And 2021 was also not good. It wasn't the worst, but it was up there for poor performance on that.
Absolutely. Now, after World War II, many countries publicly stated interest in working towards democracy, which was nice. It's a nice sentiment, though this was often done to gain support of the public, not because the beliefs were actually held. So you can kind of see this happening where it makes sense. I'm going to jump on the bandwagon because I don't want to be associated with those guys. And so it makes sense that people would do that. But if they don't commit to it or it's kind of a false rule, then we see it kind of decline.
So yeah, this led to ongoing efforts to discredit and try and destroy democracy where it existed. You can think of the recent effect in the United States with the overturning of Roe versus Wade, which has to do with access to abortion. You can think of Hydra from the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah.
Taliban forces taking back the Afghanistan government once the U.S. troops left. You can think of Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. Again, sort of the ultra-conservative far-right authoritarian figure as well. So examples of this going on.
Right, absolutely. I think another thing that's important to state here is that authoritarianism is a value, a belief, and a set of behaviors. It's kind of all tied together, and it's not a person. A single person is typically not the authoritarian. Authoritarian regimes and governments tend to be groups of people that control power. So when you remove a dictator or their forces, it doesn't equate to removing authoritarianism. What it does is equates to removing that person who was an authoritarian, and you've essentially created a power vacuum or a gap in that space unless you decide to fill it up. So, for example, in U.S. politics, think of Trump and his exit from the presidency. You kind of think about Trump being, a lot of people would kind of designate him as an authoritarian, trying to run authoritarian regimes. And so removing him was supposed to solve the issue. But we are still dealing with people like DeSantis, McConnell. I mean, you're seeing kind of a lot of those tendrils of the authoritarianism type of approach still present, because once you can remove the head, two more will grow in its place. That's all I'm saying.
Well, and the deep root system of the whole thing, too.
Yeah, exactly. And so all the state and the local people who have the same values are now in place, still in place. I mean, you still got Marjorie Taylor Greene that is still in place, who is very much so on this authoritarian side, despite the fact that she talks about other freedoms and whatnot. And so removing them is much harder because you have to kind of remove a lot of people from that space to understanding that they have those types of values, if that's something that you are actively involved in.
Yeah, I mean, and just as a quick side note, and this will be relevant again for discussion we're aiming toward now, is the fact that a lot of times what they'll do is the authoritarian figure will scream about giving you your liberties while they're taking them away. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people just kind of buy it. They're like, yeah, you're protecting my liberties. I'm like, no, you are actively losing rights right now.
Yeah.
By the person who you think is protecting you. And that's the thing. It's like, what we'll see as we talk about it more is authoritarianism is large, a large part of it is scare tactic. And so you basically, you frighten people into believing that you're their savior, and then you can take all of their rights away. And then they're like, well, it was in our best interest. Or right now I'm more free because I have fewer rights. Because language is fun like that.
Yeah, that's coercion 101. That's what it is. I have put in a position where I've given you or presented with you something so aversive that you want to try to avoid it.
Yeah.
You are so afraid of the idea that you're going to lose rights that you're willing to buy in because I'm going to protect your rights, when the truth is I'm probably taking other rights away that you're not even well aware of.
Yeah. So there's going to be actions and appeal that those who are in authoritarian positions are going to try and hold on to power. And they're going to speak to why they should hold on to power. And again, one of them is screaming about the freedom that they're giving you while they're actually taking away. But some common settings include prisons, militaries, cults, that sort of thing, where you'll see the authoritarian rule have an effect that many people will see as being positive in those situations.
So for those in power, they get these benefits of getting consistent access to food. They get shelter. They get healthcare. I mean, there's all kinds of things that happen. They get safety and security from the outside. And they're taught that those who disagree or are not with us are against us. And so you have these situations where I'm in power. If you are my people, then you can benefit from these things too, right? Stay with me and you will have food, shelter, protection. Those others, when we talk about othering and when people when you have political parties that are turning against each other and kind of othering the other groups. That's kind of what happens. It's like, hey, you stick with me, you're going to get all these things, and it's going to be okay. You're going to get all the things that you need, and it might not even be good, and it might not even be consistent, but at least I'm going to promise these things, and then you stick with me. But if you step out of line, there's going to be hell to pay, essentially.
Yeah, and if you try and go with the other people, like if you try and join them, like they don't care about you. They're not going to make sure you have access to food and healthcare and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. They're not going to guarantee your safety. Only I can do that, baby.
Yeah.
It really does sound like the abuser's playbook.
Yeah.
Because it is. So that's kind of the way to do it.
Absolutely.
We'll take a look. For example, the United States had January 6th, 2 years ago, 2021. And in this one, the people who attacked the Capitol, they were called patriots by those who support their political alignments and called insurrectionists by those who oppose their political alignments. And so I don't know about you, but the term patriot definitely has relations that sound more appealing, right?
Right.
They sound like the loyalty and strength and for the greater good. And it has all the associations of positive things to it. So you can see why they lean toward that. While insurrectionist, of course, has the relation of evil and dangerous and disruptive and that sort of thing. And so you can see it having a negative connotation, and that whatever language you're using, you're going to be trying to influence how people view and think about that and those people.
Right. And I mean, you kind of saw the same example in the Civil War, right? Where the South and the Confederates were calling themselves patriots or doing patriot things, while the North were seeing them as deserters and traitors. So sometimes what happens here, though, and I think this is important to kind of, that might seem like a tangent or like kind of a side story that comes along with authoritarianism, but I want you to think about this. Like, authoritarian groups will use language that is fluffier or more appealing. Like, I'm going to call the people that are on my side patriots because I want to be a patriot and I want you to be a patriot, and that sounds good.
Yeah.
It's an appeal to, I guess, maybe like your sensibilities and like your pride, right? Like you want to be on this side. Like, you want to be part of this cult. You want to be part of this group. And that's kind of like how they start getting people in. And then it kind of leads to, oh, well, now that you're in, here's the rule book. Here's all the things you got to do to stay in. You want to stay in, don't you? You don't want to be out. And that's kind of how this shapes up. And it takes a long time to do this, but it shapes up over time and shapes up rapidly across the population.
Yeah, you can kind of just direct the flow, if you will, toward a particular direction. And then even if you only get a small percent of that, it's still more than you would have had otherwise. Mm-hmm. And you can see the kind of toxicity of this dynamic exist also in peer groups, sometimes in family dynamics.
Yeah.
It can exist in pretty much any place where you have a social group of people who are trying to work together. And some people hold more power in that group than others.
A really clear example of how this type of coercion works is in George Orwell's 1984. And this is really fresh in my mind. But when you read it, the entire book is this main character, Winston, is afraid to do anything that dissents from Big Brother and from the government,
right,
from Oceania. I mean, it's literally pages and pages of fear. It's fear-based behavior control. And when you read it, he's miserable the whole time.
Yeah.
The only time he's not miserable is when he's going against it, and then he gets in trouble, and they actually spend the majority of the book torturing him. If you didn't know what happens in the book, like, they spend a lot of the time torturing him. So when you start thinking about this idea of coercion and authoritarianism and what it looks like, that's really what it is. It's coercion and fear-based, and it's behavior control under those conditions.
Now, before we did research for this, did you know the difference between totalitarian and authoritarian?
I feel like I equated them to being the same thing. So please do enlighten us, Abraham.
I thought that maybe you did, but before I do that, I'm going to throw some ads your way. Okay, so we left you on the cliffhanger of difference between totalitarian and authoritarian governments. I feel like in a way, you're kind of splitting hairs. I think you look at totalitarianism and authoritarianism and communism in a way, and in practical implementation, they are very similar.
Right.
But we'll just go ahead and describe them. In authoritarian, you often have more of a military rule, and their primary concern is obedience to authority. They tend to be actually, interestingly, less concerned about sort of individual things that you might do. They don't necessarily care, like, what your sexual preferences are. They probably don't care. It's social groups you're sort of running in. As long as you're obedient to the authority and you are following their instructions and doing what they say, outside of that, you're probably relatively okay to do things that you want to do. Whereas in a totalitarian, where you're more of a sort of dictatorship, this one, they want to control everything that you do. And it's often very ideological. It's they want to control what you believe, everything, like what you wear, what your morals are, all that sort of. And so there's a lot more use of very strict control. And this, I think, is where it looks a little bit more like what communism looks like. And so they're really not, they're both very oppressive, or all three of those, depending on how you sort of parse them out. They're very oppressive regimes that do not give people the freedom to make choices for themselves. And some of them are slightly better at individual liberties than others, and they're both terrible at it in general.
Yeah.
So a way you could distinguish them, I guess, if it's useful to do so.
Yeah, I think if you were to like pull examples, like the way that I would see this would be that a totalitarian like kind of dictatorship government would be something like North Korea with Kim Jong-un, right?
Yeah.
Like that's pretty clear. Like there's a pretty clear figurehead, like there's a pretty clear like lineage and dynasty that's going on, and they control literally so much information. I mean, to the point where they don't believe that Kim Jong-un poops. So like just so you all have that information. The authoritarian piece, I would go back and I would probably equate that to something like maybe Putin's Russia, where there is a pretty strong military presence. I mean, Putin tends to be like kind of the figurehead in that, but like you're still looking at like a really big military presence and a lot of coercion in that situation. But you see, they're not that different.
Right. No, they're very, very similar. And also in your example with Putin, which I think is a good one, is you tend to see that the primary concern is obedience to the authority.
Yeah.
Are you doing what the authority figures in the authoritative state, what they want you to be doing? And as long as you are towing the line, then they're sort of like, yeah, you can listen to rock music, you can, do your whatever thing you're going to do, like, but do not question us or we will come for you.
Right. Exactly.
That sort of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think there's, digging into the sort of behavioral and psychological principles going on here. I know we're sort of running, close to, we're running long on this discussion, and I think that's okay because we're at the sort of final bit here. But there's, from a behavioral perspective, it's a ton of negative reinforcement going on, and then punishment, and often negative punishment too, where it's a lot of just avoiding persecution, avoiding prison, avoiding death, avoiding being, I guess, the target of whatever the power is. Mm-hmm. And so it's whatever you're doing is primarily based out of fear. It's like, I'm just trying to avoid aversive things from happening.
And I think if you look at this from like a longitudinal standpoint, you talk about like, okay, in the immediate, in that specific space, I'm doing this because I want to avoid the situation. But the longer I go, the more this becomes just kind of a general rule. As it gets passed down from generation to generation, especially in regimes that last for decades, then people who are born into these regimes just go, well, we do that because we've always done that.
Yeah.
That's the rule. And they've never contacted a consequence or like some kind of aversive or some kind of problem. They just do it because I'm going to avoid that situation, right?
Yeah.
So that is something that's really interesting to think about, like when you talk about long-term effects on this. It's like, short-term is I watch this regime change over. I know I've seen people disappeared. I've seen this situation happen. Long-term is my kids were born into this. They've never known a world where freedom existed. They've always followed the rules because that's what they were told to do.
And you can see why then it's easy to get into a place where you see rule following to adhere to the system as being virtuous.
Yeah.
And that you then blame victims of the state for they're the ones at fault if you believe that it was because they weren't following the rules that they were set to follow, and that it is therefore morally okay that they're persecuted because they didn't follow the sort of rules of the oppressive system in which they find themselves.
Right.
And I think, honestly, the pendulum swings both ways on that. I think you can easily point, you could argue both sides of like whether a rule that is put in place to ensure the social good and was done so, even voted for democratically, does restrict some people's freedoms. And then they see that as being oppressive. And rules that essentially oppress some people's freedoms, but that's kind of what some other people wanted for that society anyway.
Right.
Like, I didn't want people to be able to wear open-toed shoes. I'm glad the government has a ban on that.
Right.
And then that becomes a thing. And so you can sort of see on both sides of that where people argue for and against that. But I think what's really interesting is I found a really cool resource on this, digging into sort of why people tend to prefer authoritarian governments. And one of the interesting points that they made was that if you look at any situation where there is economic uncertainty or other instabilities, no matter where you fall in the political spectrum, people will equally start to lean toward preference for an authoritarian government. So the more fear that they have, the more they lean toward authoritarianism. So that's part of why authoritarianism uses fear as its primary controlling technique, because it's what got it into power in the first place. It's one of the only reasons it would exist, is because when you have an authoritarian government, people who are already afraid, they tend to prefer having that system anyway, and they're willing to overlook unethical behavior. They're willing to set aside democracy and moral standards. They're willing to let that stuff run if they're afraid and in an unstable situation.
I found that really fascinating. And they also found that was consistent across, 30 years of data, and across the globe. That wasn't consistent in a singular place.
The whole world.
It was the entire world, 30 years of data, they found that. Yeah. And I think that was really fascinating. I think the other part of it, too, that they talk about is that there is the biological process that could possibly exist in that is simply the lack of resources and safety issues, right? So, we are genetically predisposed to want to stay safe. Now, we've created a lot of verbal behavior and languaging around all that stuff. And there's some other things that have gone on that are definitely learned. But just the need to stay safe and the need to access resources tends to play a large role in how we gravitate towards certain maybe governing parties or certain local resources.
And they basically said that about a third of people, again, based on these data, tend to lean toward authoritarianism anyway. And as soon as something kicks off, there's a catalyst event that incites that fear. Immigration, we just talked a lot about in recent episodes, is a very common one. So you're being replaced, your jobs are being taken, your way of life is going away. We're going to have an increase in crime and disease and that sort of thing. It's just fear-mongering. And it's fear-mongering that points at another group that others them. So you have a them versus us sort of thing. And then you are able to attract people to your cause because you already have people who kind of tend toward that way anyway. And then you trigger the alarm bells for them. Say, be afraid, bad things are coming. Yeah. Pick us. We will support you. And what I think is the great irony of the whole thing is that they won't. You're not going to get more support and security and state and stability from an authoritarian government. They are chaotic as hell. I mean, look at the authoritarian governments that are out there. And also, people, when you live in that environment long enough, it just drags you down. And so you will occasionally, it's not consistent, but you will start to get these uprisings of people who are trying to fight against it because they do not like being oppressed. Right. An authoritarian government is good at putting those down, and they will try to, but oftentimes people prefer freedom and democracy to their authoritarian governments. Yeah. But really fun, what in the resource we're referencing here is they point to that group, that third of people that's really insulated and tends to lean toward authoritarianism anyway. They tend to be pretty dug in on their position, and no amount of data, reason, logic, facts, or science is going to have them change their opinion. So it actually just makes more sense to ensure that as much as possible, if we want freedom and liberty and democracy for more people, so they have greater access to more resources and a general higher quality of life, you can more or less ensure that by ensuring that you have equality in voting and a political system, and as much as possible equitable access to resources in a given place. And also by putting in policies that reduce the kind of instability that people can then lean on for fear-mongering to try and install themselves as authoritarian figures. And if you get those things going, then you're more likely to be able to secure freedom and democracy.
I mean, at this point in time, I think that you just hit all the hallmarks and all the take-home points that I would have made too. I have nothing to say beyond that. That was perfect.
Mic drop.
Perfect. I love it. So good. I mean, you're right. I think that's at the end of the day, the thing is people will always rise up. They're going to get sick and tired of being coerced. People are going to snap back. I mean, and that's just kind of, you see that time and time again in the research. You see that in animal literature. You see that all the time. When an organism is in pain or discomfort and it lasts periods of time, they'll either learn to kind of just deal with it, or they're going to fight back. And most of the time they'll end up fighting back.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, I think we've said what we have to say about authoritarianism. I thought it might be a two-parter, but I think we are able to sort of squeeze it all together in this one discussion. So anything else before we move on to some recommendations?
I'd like to pat ourselves on the back for not turning this into a 2-part. I think we did pretty good with that.
Yeah, you're welcome, audience, and good job, us.
Good job, us. All right, let's do recommendations.
Recommendations.
So one of the things I have learned as I'm getting older is that I'm just slowly morphing into my father. And so part of it is growing up, my dad always listened to like a lot of like classic rock and stuff. And I think I've talked about that on the show, but every now and again, I'll go revisit something that I listened to a bunch as a kid. And I was like, man, this is actually really good and totally informs some of the music I listen to now. Like, I really like sludge metal and like really heavy stuff like that and really noisy things. And then I'm like, oh, right, Black Sabbath. Thank you for that. I like really weird kind of like strange time signatures. Thank you, Led Zeppelin, for giving us that. Right. So like it's all there. Or like Pink Floyd is another one where I'm like, okay, yeah. Well, one that I just recently visited because I'm a big fan of this band called the Gaslight Anthem. I went and listened to Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. And that's my recommendation, is to go listen to Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. He's a Florida musician who unfortunately passed away and has so many hit songs that nobody realizes how many hit songs he absolutely had. Everybody's like, yeah, I know Free Fallin', but people forget I Won't Back Down. You Don't Know How It Feels. Don't Do Me Like That. Listen to Her Heart. Breakdown. The Waiting. I mean, all of it. Mary Jane's Last Dance. If you're somebody who uses Spotify, you can actually listen to his career collection. It's called The Best of Everything, the definitive career spanning hits collection from 1976 to 2016. And it is such a good listen. It's like such a nice slice of like Americana music, like just good American rock music.
I love that. And I love that as your recommendation too. It's, I don't know how to describe it exactly. I guess it does feel wholesome, but it also just like what an open invitation to like come enjoy something that's readily available to people and has been for decades.
Yeah, exactly. And you can access it without somebody telling you not to access it. So please go do that. I mean, it's genuinely great. I'm listening to it like, man, American Girl. Oh, what a great song.
It's like, when people always say, I guess I don't think people say this anymore because it's a nonsense statement, but enjoy your food because there are people who are starving in Africa is like the common sort of racist saying that people would use.
Right.
Or like finish your food because there's starving people. I feel like enjoy your Tom Petty because there are people in Saudi Arabia who don't get to listen to Tom Petty.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
Or just, you're free to make whatever choice you want to make because, we at least live in a democratic, mostly free society.
Yeah, exactly.
And many of the people who have access to this podcast around the world also will have at least somewhat free societies. So congrats on that.
Yes. So go listen to Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers.
Yeah. So listen to Tom Petty. That's the moral of the story.
Yeah. Dave Grohl almost played drums for them after Nirvana broke up. He's like, he had a choice between starting the Foo Fighters or going to play drums in Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. So.
Well, I can't fault him for starting the Foo Fighters. So and Tom Petty seems to have done well with their drummers. So good for them.
Yeah. It all worked out.
I am recommending candy because it's so good for you and your teeth.
Here for it.
This is from a brand called Avenue Sweets, and they make these vegan caramels. Now, you wouldn't necessarily think, but caramel is very hard to come by that is also vegan.
Yes.
So whenever I have an opportunity to, I'm always very excited. And theirs are delicious. They are so good. I don't know if it's like a regional thing, because I know that I get them at sort of the co-op here in my city. I think I looked online. It seemed like they're at least nationally available. So if you're in the United States, look them up. If you're interested, you can try in other countries, see if you can find it. But Avenue Sweets vegan caramels, or I think they do like non-vegan caramels as well, but they have, you can get those anywhere. So
yeah,
vegan caramel is a little bit more difficult to come by, and I found theirs to be just really, really good.
I love that for you. And you're right. They are very difficult to find.
Yeah. And often don't taste great when they do.
Right.
But these do taste good. So there's that.
Yeah, they look good. They look awesome.
Yeah, particularly their vanilla ones.
And you can get a whole big jar.
Yeah.
You can get a 4-pound gallon jar.
Wow, that is a lot of caramel. That's probably more than
so
I need.
Good. Yeah, maybe.
All right. Well, if you're an authoritarian or you want to tell us about authoritarianism, you should definitely write in and tell us. You can also tell us about caramels or candy or old bands that you love that you think other people should like. We're happy to hear all of that stuff, really.
Yes.
Reach out to us on social media. You can also email us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com. What I did not say at the beginning of this episode is that you can support us financially and otherwise. One of those ways that's not financial is you can just subscribe, follow us, or whatever platform you're listening to us on that has a let me get more of this in my feed button. Press that button and then you will be here always for you every week with new content and sometimes bonus content and sometimes nostalgia content.
Yes.
And all that good stuff. And if you leave us a rating and review, then even more people will find us and get to experience the joy that you've been experiencing for the last hour and handful of minutes that this episode's been going on. And all future ones, of course. In addition, you can support us financially if you want. You can go pick up some merch on our merch store. Shane will send you a bunch of it. Otherwise, it might come from another place. But otherwise, you order it, it'll make its way to you, and that helps us do our thing, and it's great.
Yes.
It's also free advertising for us, for you to carry around our logo on things. So consider doing us that service.
Yeah, everybody wins.
Everybody wins. You get a thing, we get advertising and money, everybody wins. Capitalism works. That's not the lesson. You can also just support us by going to Patreon, and members get special things. At a certain level, you actually get deals on merch, so there's a thing there. You also get access to notes, videos, behind-the-scenes content, early access to episodes, ad-free content, all that sort of thing. So although you probably enjoy the ads listening to us, and I know that you don't, you could listen to us ad-free if you wish. I would enjoy that for you.
Me too.
You still have to listen to the ad segues, but the ads will not fill the time between the segues. So you just get the jokes and none of the crap that comes after the jokes.
None of the fluff.
Yeah. Otherwise, I would like to thank the people who have already joined us on Patreon. That is Amanda, Brad, The Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kelly, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. Thank you all for your continued support and helping us do what we do. Thank you so much to my team. That is Alan, Jess, Patrick, Justin, and of course, Shane. Thank you for recording with me today. And again, special shout out to Patrick for helping us put together these notes.
Yeah, they were fantastic. So much fun to go through.
Yeah, so great job on that. I felt like this went well. As I said, reach out to us if you have anything to say. Thank you so much for listening. Is there anything that I missed, Shane?
Nothing else.
All right, then this is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.
That sort of thing, and what are the causes and that sort of thing, nature and nurture and that sort of thing, due to the variability and that sort of thing, and all that sort of thing, and what are the causes and that sort of thing, nature and nurture and that sort of thing, due to the variability and that sort of thing.